folks, welcome back to Indaba Africa. This is Chris once again. Hey folks, welcome back to Chris Wide Africa here on the Indaba Africa channel, part of the Indaba Broadcasting Network. On Friday, the 19th of February, a lekker Freitag. I hope everyone's finding themselves well around the world as I sit here and fight the YouTube censors over content that has no reason for being blocked. Still puzzled about that one. Anyway, folks, welcome to the channel. Special feature guest today will be Dr. Colin Robinson. He's been on the channel a couple times previously. Most recently, we talked about the Cabo Delgado province in Mozambique and the burgeoning insurgency taking place there, along with another guest. So he's back to talk to us today, and he is a subject matter expert on... My volume is low? Why is my volume low? Okay, hang on a second before we go anywhere. No, there's nothing wrong with my volume. It's cranked up all the way. You need to work on your device and turn up your volume there. Volume's up all the way. Anyway, as I was saying, Dr. Colin Robinson, he's a Kiwi from New Zealand. And since he's not an All Black fan, we can forgive him for being a Kiwi. Just kidding. Just kidding. But seriously, he is a renowned expert on Somalia, which was supposed to have elections on the 8th of February. And from what I've seen, it was kind of like pushed aside. Let's get an update on that. Let me welcome in Colin right now. Colin, how's it? Oh, you're on mute still.
Things are not good overnight. There's been firing on what appeared to be peaceful protesters. So things are not getting better.
We're talking about in Mogadishu or what?
In Mogadishu, there was fighting between the president's security forces and potentially opposition forces at the site of a planned demonstration. The government's forces may have tried to invade the hotel where the opposition candidates and former presidents were staying. And then we had another 6th of January in US terms. We had the opposition, we had the government, President Farmajo's forces, seemingly firing on a peaceful protest underway. Though the situation is not clear. Those are all first reports. And as Chris knows just as well as I do, first reports can be wrong and distorted and subject to further developments.
And usually inflamed by emotion of the moment, that sort of thing. But somehow I doubt what's happening in Mogadishu is related to the 500,000 peaceful demonstrators who appeared using their constitutionally guaranteed right to seek redress from the government. The shooting you're talking about might be more akin to the 36 criminal and people who broke into the Capitol building that was undefended. That sounds more akin to it, just for clarity there.
That's what I meant.
Okay. Just checking.
The 3,000 people that broke into the Capitol during a session of the United States Congress and Senate when they should have been outside the Capitol.
Yep, absolutely. I agree with you 100%. The 36 people that broke in, the 90 that the police let in, never should have been in the building. They should all be prosecuted to the full extent of the law. As you can see, ladies and gentlemen, Colin and I, even though we're colleagues and get along, clearly are from different sides of the political aisle. So when people come on my channel and say, oh, all you ever have on there are right-wing or conservative or old white guys, Colin's not old. I think he's a white guy, but anyway, he might be Maori.
Well, I come up sort of red on your screen, but really more pinkish given all this hot sun in Nairobi.
Well, actually, that's right. You're in Kenya. We should let people know that. And Colin, as I tell everyone, I too am a person of color. I'm pink, in case you haven't noticed. But anyway, so go ahead.
Yes, there was President Mohammed Abdullahi Mohammed, or Farmajo, known to all and sundry. Farmajo means cheese. So President Cheese has been in power since about February 2017 onwards, and he came in on a wave of public acclaim and support that the major divides in Somali politics might be bridged, and there might be some further progress towards building solid regional governments and institutions. However, what he has done in the past 4 years or so has actually been more of along the lines of co-opting and capturing the regional governments by a variety of underhand skullduggery and use of Ethiopian forces in underhand ways, and bribing and cajoling and removing opposition candidates and sweeping them off to house arrest, etc., to the point where he was able to pack the lower house of parliament, the lower house of parliament being nominated by and arranged by the governors of the territories he'd suborned, towards the end of 2020. And his term legally ran out on the 8th of February, but he is still sitting there, aided and abetted, it appears, by the governments of the United Kingdom and the United States of America, who are coming down in support of the incumbent, that is President Farmajo, but it is really not at all clear that he should be there in any way, shape or form. There are moves towards creating some sort of arrangement that could lead to new elections, but that is very bumpy, very distorted, and President Farmajo gives every indication that he wants to stay on legally, illegally, or straight in under the by the threat and use of naked force. So this is starting to look like a typical African country that doesn't have major involvement from the international community or the major world powers. But in this case, it's a little different because the United States, the United Kingdom, France, etc., have been very involved in Somalia for quite a long time, ever since the deaths of 18 US Special Forces personnel in mid-1993 or 1994, the Black Hawk Down affair. So it is
93. It's like
93. Oh, thank you, Chris.
No, that's right. That's very, very vivid in my mind because I was supposed to be there. I was pulled off the plane just before I went to Somalia, and because 94 was Rwanda, and so we had that joy the next year just before I left Germany, and I was supposed to go to Rwanda.
Well, yeah, you were lucky you weren't between the site of the two Black Hawk crashes anyway.
Well, I would have been in Kismayu as it turned out, so it would have been a lot better.
Oh well, Kismayu is a lovely town. From my single visit there, it's just a little bit sun parched. So do go on. That's the story in 10 words. Okay. But I'm happy to go on in more detail as you might think.
Let's point out a couple things for folks because not everyone in the audience is probably familiar with it. But of course, when we're talking about, you mentioned Ugandans, I would imagine you're talking about the Ugandan People's Defense Force, which is a component of the African Union mission in Somalia, AMISOM mission. That you said President Cheese is trying to co-opt them, and is that who you're talking about?
I didn't actually mention the Ugandans, but yes, there's a very large 20,000 strong or so African Union peacekeeping force, which is actually a regional fighting force there.
Yeah, so war fighting
Ugandans,
force, yeah.
Burundians, Ethiopians, Kenyans, who are really in their control and protect their own borders, and the Djiboutians as well. Up until the early part of this year, there are also 500 or so US Special Operations Forces running around with lots of helicopters and the odd drone strike and the odd MV-22 Osprey helicopters. They have gone now, been withdrawn, and that means the opposition insurgents, Al-Shabaab, are very much on the front foot right now, killing people, miscommunicating, spreading disinformation, and generally making things very hard for most people.
So with AMISOM having been, the African Union mission having been in Somalia since 2007, and actually a warfighting force, so it's different than the chapters. Well, was it Chapter 4 and Chapter 6? I think it is the United Nations, but whichever it is. But
Chapter 6, yes.
Chapter 6, yeah. So the United Nations didn't want to take that mission on because they didn't want a warfighting mission. They didn't think that they didn't. It was I wouldn't want to say they didn't want to say it was called for, but they preferred to let someone else do it. But the AMISOM mission,
pretty much, yeah. Yes, they'd rather have the AU doing it.
Right. So, but they've been there since 2007, and they've been fighting Al-Shabaab. And in the early days, they got their hat handed to them by Al-Shabaab. Then U.S. did lots of bilateral training and billions in support and equipment, and those forces were there, improved, especially the Ugandans. They went on the offensive, but didn't have the mobility with helicopters and such, back and forth, back and forth. The U.S. eventually went in there. Now we're pulling out. So after 14 years, AMISOM still can't subdue Al-Shabaab. Did I get something wrong?
No, you just didn't quite mention the parallels, which is after 17 years, the United States couldn't quite subdue the Taliban. And after about 10 plus years in Iraq, a third of the US Army trained Iraqi army collapsed after it was over politicized, and you didn't get a political solution. Neither in Afghanistan, nor in Iraq, nor in Somalia is there a sustainable political solution required to build an army. You need a proper state to build an army on. And once you get a proper state, you can build a proper army. There is unfortunately a very contested state in Afghanistan, very much a politicized mess under Maliki up till 2014 in Iraq. And in Somalia, they're all at each other's throats.
Well, you stole my thunder. That's what I was headed towards, and with the unnecessary and not germane topics of Afghanistan and Iraq. But the point I was trying to make is that it's not a military solution. It's a political solution, and the Somalis have to sort themselves out, and they seem incapable or unwilling. That's where I'm going. 14 years of African Union support there, not just military, but also to the government. Lots of resources from the European Union, cash especially, but also training and things like that. It's a political solution, and that's been the question ever since 1990 when Siad Barre collapsed. We're still waiting for a political solution, or am I missing something there?
If I may go back again, the same kind of issues are visible again in Afghanistan, Iraq, South Sudan, the Congo, Mali, and a number of these places. It's what the political scientists Chabal and Delors called, quote unquote, very long, hefty academic quote, the political instrumentalization of disorder. The elites in these places do better with disorder because they can control the inward flowing huge amounts of security related foreign monies flowing into the country. They expropriate, they extort significant amounts of that. What a French political scientist called extroversion. They just take the spigot of foreign money and they divert it into all kinds of things, including amazing numbers of wonderful retirement homes in Nairobi in the United States and the United Kingdom and Canada. There's a large Somali community in Canada or in the Midwest, and that money flows away and it doesn't reach or develop the people, and they get more by having not a political solution. So
you're talking about the elites, that they get more, but the people don't.
They get more. Yeah. The people, they get screwed. Well, after 50 years of war, after 40 years of war in Afghanistan, after nigh on 70 years of on-off war in the South Sudan, after 30 years of decay and degradation in Iraq, the people just get their noses ground into the dust.
Yeah, no doubt about it. I mean, we could add the Congo in there too. I mean,
the Congo,
arguably, you make the case that
easily
Mobutu's
lots of any of these places.
Yeah, Mobutu's entire regime was essentially an assault on the people, especially the East Kivu and places like that. So that war never really ended from the time that Lumumba was murdered, and it just kept going on, just different levels of flame. But yeah, no, that's what I was getting at, is the political solution. The elites seem to have their way of doing rent seeking and getting what they want and convincing donors to do things. This is one of the reasons why I was adamantly opposed to our increased involvement in Somalia. I didn't oppose AMISOM, but I did have an issue when we started putting our first 50 cap of special forces into Mogadishu. It seemed to me to be a pretty
Do you remember the first force caps in Vietnam, perchance?
Well,
we'll only put 500 special forces in there.
I am a historian, and I do recall MACV, and it was 16,000 when Kennedy was assassinated, and by the time he turned around,
500,000 about 10 years later.
Well, yes, not even 10 years. Not even 10 years later.
Less than 10. 7 years later, by 1970. Yes, well, indeed.
65, we already had 500,000 in there. When we went to Idrang Valley, we were already up to 500,000 by then. It's crazy.
All right. Well, and 200,000 of those were base and support forces. The ridiculous divisional slices of the 1960s, or corps and army level slices.
Absolutely. But I think the point we're getting at, where I was headed, and you alluded to, is that this cap of 50, and the next thing you know, it's 500, and who knows where we're headed, because people keep
We did manage to avoid this problem in El Salvador. They managed to keep the cap reasonably low, and for what it's worth, Central America is not a sodden mess now, leaving aside Colombia, which is a slightly different issue.
Well, and politically, Venezuela I would throw into that loop too.
Venezuela and Colombia are slightly different issues, but Central America came out without too many troubles.
That's true. That's because half El Salvador lives in California, but that's another story.
All right, we can go off on these tangents anytime you like, but we did try to start on Somalia.
That's
basically true. The point both Chris and I are trying to make is that continued war benefits more the elites, and those elites feed across what the South Africans in the audience will think of as tribal divisions. In Somalia, they're clan divisions. In Kenya, where I sit at the moment, they're tribal divisions. In Uganda, there are more type tribal divisions. But Somalia is interesting and to a degree unique because they all speak one language. These are all interconnected families. They're not different nations. It's one nation that has been thoroughly splintered by subdividing families over and over again, and building on or decaying from the reputation of one of the nastiest dictators on the continent, Mohammed Siad Barre. Not quite maybe in his uppers there with Mobutu Sese Seko in the Congo, but one of the worst of the African dictators, and certainly one that could just about have the claim for one of the two or three worst inflictions of pain and violence and nastiness on the women, children, and men of Somalia. I got into Somalia looking at the first few minutes of the start of the movie Black Hawk Down, and while that's all fictionalized with the ridiculous soldiers down there at 9 o'clock as the helicopter is swinging around in a circle, but it's very real stuff. Only you have to see that sequence of Black Hawk Down repeated on a scale of thousands upon thousands upon thousands, millions and millions, really, in the 30 years that have passed.
Yeah. And of course, the Siad Barre regime was, as you mentioned, quite brutal, but also quite stupid. I mean, they instigated a war against Ethiopia, got their hat handed to them. But the interesting thing about Somalia and Ethiopia, of course, besides the fact that there's a lot of Somalis in Ethiopia and there's border questions and contested, is, of course, that under Haile Selassie, Ethiopia was a U.S. ally and allied with the West, and Somalia was allied with the Soviet bloc. And then the revolution overthrew Haile Selassie and murdered his son and a lot of the elites. The other 600,000 fled to America. And suddenly Ethiopia was in the Soviet bloc, and we became friends with Somalia. And it's never been good since.
I in my teaching role with the US Air Force Air University, I now look at the South China Sea. And in that regard, what is increasingly clear to me is, at least in the context of my own country, New Zealand, and looking at the United States and China, the only thing that happens to the grass, whether the elephants are fighting or making love, is the grass gets trampled.
Yep. Absolutely. We've got Lore Leighton, who is a viewer from Finland, who's popped in to watch this stream today. Welcome, Lore. I just want to welcome you since you're coming in from Finland. And she says it's -7. Well, it's -3 here, so I guess you win the contest on who's got the colder weather in Finland.
I would only say that it's about less than 20 degrees here, but pretty dry and dusty.
Yeah, in Nairobi, which is where you're at right now.
In Nairobi.
Yeah, just so people are clear on that. The last time Colin was on, I had to do this stream, and no, wait, you had to get up at an ungodly hour. The first time you were on, I had to get up at an ungodly hour because I made sure I didn't inconvenience my guest. I was up at like 2 o'clock, 3 o'clock in the morning doing the stream because it was New Zealand time. The last time you got up at an ungodly hour because we had a guest on from the UK, so it was kind of weird.
Well, this is the perils of globetrotting.
Well, I guess what with us being pseudo global elites, just not the wealthy ones, we have to live with the perils of our privilege. But yeah, so Somalia. So there was supposed to be this election on the 8th of February, correct? And it didn't happen.
No, the President from Mohammed Abdullahi Mohammed, always known as President Farmajo, cheese.
I will call him forever and going forward, Asiago.
Well, whichever. His term was supposed to finish. His 4-year term was supposed to finish on the 8th of February. Elections are usually supposed to be held before a president or a parliament's term ends. That's the general practice in the OECD all around the world. But the way that Somali electoral politics works is it's always put together late. It's always put together last minute, and it's usually put together in what used to be called, in my terms, a smoke-filled room. Just the elites negotiating with each other. And at this point, he let the timetable run out because he appears. There are more and more comparisons with Mohammed Siad Barre circulating on social media all over the place. He seems to want to try and extend himself, not quite as far as Putin, our friend Vladimir Vladimirovich, who is now around for 20 years plus and has extended himself for, I don't know, another 10 or 15 years.
Well, to be fair, Putin did leave office and run the government through Medvedev. We can't forget that.
Do you want to hear my favorite Putin joke?
Go ahead.
My favorite Putin joke is Putin, Medvedev, and a couple of other officials come into a restaurant, and the head owner or waiter rushes up to Mr. Putin and says, "Mr. Putin, what will you have?" And Putin, of course, says, "Well, I'll have the meat." No problem. And the vegetables? Oh, those people, they'll have the meat too.
Okay.
My interpretation of how much Medvedev was running the government in those 4 years is
that's
not high.
Well, I mean, that's why, of course, when we was called off mic, Barack Obama, of course, said, "Tell Vlad I could do more for him after the election." That's very telling how the elites reveal themselves when they think they're in private. Anyway, but
the point on Somalia is that they should have arranged something before the term ending. They didn't. That is very usual in terms of Somalia, that it's always left to the last minute. But here, Farmajo appears to be trying to push himself onward, with whatever means he can, including use of naked force, shooting of demonstrators.
That's really unfortunate. But look, we don't have to go as far afield as Putin to find a good example for him to follow. I mean, Asiago has regional examples like Yoweri Museveni and Paul Kagame right there in the region that he can follow for duration and longevity.
This is true. This is true. There are lots of well maturing. Museveni, M7, given his proximity to the Somali issue in terms of thousands of Ugandan troops, who I should note that that one of the nasty things about this situation is the Ugandans and Burundians who have been fighting and dying in their hundreds since 2007 are still being underpaid compared to much more peacefully operating and better off United Nations peacekeepers in all of the quieter spots. Yep. But they're being paid about less than an 80%-ish mark, and they're fighting and dying every day.
No, absolutely. And
it's one of the reasons why me and a co-author of mine are looking at recommendations to be hopefully put forward in RUSI Journal on a UN-AU hybrid mission.
There's all kinds of problems with it. Of course, the United Nations, when I was involved in that operation in Somalia, the United Nations was supposed to be paying for maintenance and repairs and things like that were submitted. You submit vouchers from the troop contributing nations like Uganda, and at the time, Sierra Leone was also involved until Ebola, and then they wouldn't let them come back. But the Royal Sierra Leone armed forces, the RSLAF. But the United Nations was supposed to pay for these things. And of course, we had a problem because a lot of the equipment, particularly armored vehicles and such and trucks that these national forces had, were donated by the U.S. So they didn't have the title to it. And so they went to the UN, and the UN's like, where's the title? Like, well, we don't have that. Well, that doesn't belong to you, so we're not going to repair it. The owner isn't part of the mission. It was just a disaster from that standpoint. You talk about salaries, but yeah, these folks are woefully underpaid because they're engaged in combat. And we've seen hundreds of troop contributing nation countries' troops go home in boxes, sadly, from Somalia.
And one of the interesting things is that number in terms of a UN peacekeeping mission is usually very well known. Yeah. As it happens for this mission, mostly probably because of President Museveni's worries about his domestic popularity, there are no exact numbers about how many peacekeepers, warfighters, Ugandan and Burundian and other warfighters have been killed in Somalia, though the estimates range between about 1,400 and 1,800, the best estimates public anyway, over the course of this 13 years.
Yeah, no, absolutely. It's that was one thing that we didn't see a lot of. Now, I saw troops staging to go to Somalia out of Entebbe, and I saw them coming back, as well as, coffins and that sort of thing on occasion. But I have even no estimate, even as close as I was working with the Ugandan People's Defense Force about what was going on. It was really not something that that they wanted to share with anybody or want anybody to see. Usually when casualties came back, it was usually under cover of darkness that they were removed from aircraft. That
sounds all of a piece with the way African dictators usually try and run their countries.
Yeah, no, it's really unfortunate, but I don't know if we've ever talked about this, Colin, but do you know that when the Somali National Force, the core cadre, were trained in Uganda by the Ugandans with oversight? With oversight from the European Union training mission when it was still located in Uganda. I don't know if you know this, but I was actually the paymaster for the Somali soldiers. I'm the one that approved and paid all the soldiers.
Oh, does that mean you have records of how many that were there? In which case I need to ask you.
I can neither confirm nor deny the response to that question. No, actually, yeah, there are records. You could probably get a Freedom of Information request from the U.S. government and ask for it. It might take them a while to find it, but yeah, no.
Yes. Oh, well, I'll just write to the OSC in Kampala, I suppose, though it'll take no end of a. Well, yes, or maybe better sent to Stuttgart.
You could ask them, but what they'll do is tell you to send it to now maybe Stuttgart. They might be able to take the Freedom of Information request directly, but the OSC won't be able to do that because they can't release the information publicly unless they're given permission. But yeah, so the request would have to go probably to Africa Command or the DoD directly. But yeah, Freedom of Information Act might get that information. But what I can tell you is this: is that when I was there and we had the Ugandans, and they actually left during my tenure there because they finished up that initial cohort of 2,500. We did have a few that went astray and disappeared and never came back. But the numbers were in a couple dozen at most. And that's the reason why the Ugandans suggested that they come to Uganda, in part, not only because they wanted to be involved and have influence over the future forces, but also because when Museveni was in exile, they were abroad outside the country, and they got refuge, and they were away from families and away from all the distractions, and they trained as a cohort and became, in their view, effective guerrillas and a force. And so they thought the same sort of thing would work well for the Somalis, to be away from cot and away from all the daily distractions.
Absolutely. It's a standard thing. When in mid 2017, they tried to get President Donald J. Trump across the river to the tank and brief him about major world economic and military issues. And this was the occasion when Secretary Mattis, in a different setting, and this was the occasion when Secretary Mattis made his famous or unfamous comment about how focused. Yes, we'll say how focused President Trump was at the time. Retreats sometimes work. They sometimes don't. Unfortunately, for the first three brigades of the Hawiye Brigadier, etc., Somali National Army, you can't take them to Uganda for 3 months and change their entire a way of operating into a administrative, bureaucratic, rather than charismatic, patrimonial, patron-client type setup. Unfortunately, they've been in a disorganized Somalia for 20 plus years. Retreats work better when you've got something to build, a much more stronger thing to build upon.
Well, that's exactly right. And that was one of the criticisms I have when I went to Uganda for the Office of Security Cooperation and began running things. One of the things I said, why are we doing this? I understand, I appreciate what Uganda is saying. It makes sense to take the Somali out of Somalia, but you can't take Somalia out of the Somali. It isn't. Their culture, their norms are still there. They're going to return. Unless they have a vested interest in this, it's not going to go well. And it didn't, in my view, go particularly well.
Well, not the way I'm writing up the 3rd Brigade of the Somali Army today, anyway, the new 6th Brigade. They're one of the nastiest bunch of operators I have ever heard of since some of the nastiest in the Eastern Congo.
I did mention they were trained by the European Union training mission, not by me, correct? Just so you know.
No. You said you paid them extra when you went through all the Leahy Act checks for how to rape and pillage, gang rape, kneecappings, and all the other things out of the U.S. Army Special Forces manual.
Actually, there's
I'm
no such.
Joking.
I know you're joking. But for clarity, there was no Leahy vetting because we weren't training them. That was direct.
Oh, okay.
That was a European Union training mission, and that's why it was a unique situation. The Ugandans did the training, the oversight, and things were run by the European Union training mission, and then we agreed with foreign operations money, foreign assistance, to pay for, with using our peacekeeping operations fund, to pay for reimbursement for equipment, for fuel, for transport, and to pay the salaries while they were in Uganda, so that, because there was no one to pay them. So we weren't required to do Leahy vetting for that, to my knowledge. That was before.
And this is the other thing. All the public reporting says UTM trained them, but they were being trained by UPDF.
Yes, by UPDF with the Europeans there.
With the Europeans just sort of doing standards and practices, vetting stuff.
Well, the Europeans were also training, but the Europeans were mostly oversight and coordination and scheduling and putting that in place. But yes, where there were Dutch and French that actually did training, yes, but the majority of the actual training was done by Ugandans, the UPDF.
Okay, well, that's something that's not very clear, or I'll have to go back into Paul Williams's book again. You learn a new thing every day. But the essential, while Chris and I go back and forth about obscure military details in Central Africa, the point about Somalia at the moment is that despite 13 years and billions of dollars and thousands of lives, this kind of quote unquote standard textbook international UN, US approach of sending thousands of troops to a country, trying to hang around for 5 years, stage an election, and then run the hell out as fast as possible, just doesn't work. We've tried this in, let me think, 1, Iraq. Let me think 2, Afghanistan. Let me think 3, South Sudan. Let me think 4, Mali, Congo. Let me think 6, East Timor. Let me think, it just goes on. We cannot build a new state on the basis of a very destroyed country where the education system has been ground down to the point you get what I saw in Liberia. My master's students who are actually really on the grade of high school leavers. Peace is not one potential real answer out of this. Peace is not inevitable. Nobody is going automatically directly towards more peaceful world. War and peace coexists in the human condition. There are war-torn places and there are peaceful places, and there's nothing magic so far we've discovered to make all these war-torn places peaceful.
Well, absolutely, But you mentioned that approach, but that isn't the only approach we've taken historically. We've done that. We did that in Latin America back in the 30s and 40s. I mean, gunboat diplomacy. We sent Marines repeatedly to the Dominican Republic and throughout the Caribbean basin, treating it as our own backyard for decades, for various reasons, propping up or removing governments and trying to restore order or restore, an economic advantage that we had in places. But we've also tried other approaches. I mean, so that's akin to what you're talking about with trying to come in and do these things. But even trying to do it in a remote
you've tried
fashion.
the confessions of an economic hitman approach.
But
Putting the huge amounts of debt into a country so that you can hold the government to ransom.
Well, in Latin America, yes, that's a true statement. But certainly, but what I'm getting at is that we tried other approaches too. I mean, throughout Africa during the Cold War, we relied on proxies in Angola and in Somalia. We've used it with Amazon. We've relied on proxies throughout the continent, and that doesn't work either because the people involved must have the will and the desire to go somewhere. The reason that the conflict ended in Liberia wasn't because the U.S. under Bush finally put some ships off coast with some Marines. That played a role, but people were exhausted. They were exhausted, and that's why the war finally ended. The reason the war ended in Sierra Leone is because the Brits sent 1 battalion minus in there, and a brutal war that went on for years was ended in essentially 3 weeks, primarily because it wasn't ECOWAS.
UNAMSIL, yes. Yeah. It was David Richards in the 1st Battalion in the Parachute Regiment.
Exactly.
Yes. Acting against his own orders to only run a non-combatant evacuation operation.
And quite well done.
One of the reasons he ended up as Chief of Defence Staff. But the thing that both Chris and I are pointing at is the will of the people is really important. Whatever our South African viewers think about the state and nature of the African National Congress, the truth is that a large proportion of the population of South Africa still has a great deal of respect for a party that led its way out of the horrific experience of 40 years plus of apartheid. Mm-hmm. And whatever Chris and I may go back and joke about, the will of the people is really the thing that can lead slowly and with bumps and with difficulties and with problems to a better solution for most of the countries involved. It's just about how to do it and how to calm down and how to restrain the thieving and rapacious nastiness of the political elites that seem to get hung up along the way.
Absolutely. John Jarvis, I think, is being cheeky, says Chris was there in a stabilizing role. This goes back to the conversation we had yesterday, but I think he's being cheeky. No, I was not in a stabilizing role. I was there in a security assistance role with the Ugandan People's Defense Force, who was doing the training and providing the facilities. Therefore, I was involved because of that. And then Constantinople says, Constantinople, keep the gate closed, says that he's watching Biden. He said America's back. Listen, I'm sure that another 30 people are watching the Manchurian Cadaver on TV right now besides you, Constantinople. So we'll check in on what Unity Joe had to say later on. But no, the Somalia issue is it's a mess. It's a mess. I mean, there are times it appears as if there might be progress, or at least externally it looks like progress. But I mean, where are we really at, Colin? Here we are, 2021. It's been a long time, and we're not there politically.
Where are we at? I am writing recommendations to put the peacekeeping force back in there, revitalized with some more rigor instituted by the United Nations, which does have a significant amount of practice and experience compared to the African Union, for at least another 3 to 4 to 5 years. The alternative is having a black flag with Al-Shabaab, not Islamic State, Al-Shabaab running the place. Even the food the president eats is being taxed by Al-Shabaab right now. And conservatively, I give it 2 to 3 weeks. If you yank the African Intervention Force out, I give it 2 to 3 weeks before we have a few islands of government presence by Doha, Johar, bits and pieces in Mogadishu among an Al-Shabaab sea, just the way it was before the Ethiopians came in 2006. I'm sorry, it's going to go on.
No, it's best to be honest about this, make an honest assessment, because I think a lot of people politically just either don't want to hear the truth or walk with blinders and just don't want to be distracted by the reality. And hard decisions must be made one way or another. Now, what you're talking about is to bring military forces in. That may help vanquish Al-Shabaab.
Maintaining military forces, yes.
Well, no, but you said, okay, I misunderstood. I thought you were talking about a UN force.
No, I'm. What we have now is a pure AU African force, which is mostly actually a regional intervention force.
Yeah.
What I would be doing is merging the UN political mission, UNSOM, the African fighting mission, AMISOM, and the UN support mission, UNSOS, into a combined multifunctional peacekeeping mission under a standard UN model, exactly the model that's going on in Mali, exactly the model that's going on in the Congo, exactly the model that's going on in South Sudan, which would at least solve the unity of command problem. Instead of 3 missions getting tangled in each other's way, you'd have 1 with some injection, it's not a significant degree, but some injection of United Nations impartiality and better logistics and administration.
Well, hopefully it would work. I mean, I would assume you would expect that probably the UN would be the senior mission commander or something like that, because if we've seen the past with AMISOM, one of the major problems with AMISOM historically has been is that while it is an AU force, the most of the countries operate as unilateral actors. They don't really coordinate their stuff very well. They do their own thing, and we see all kinds of problems.
But that was exactly our problem in Afghanistan or Liberia. Or what did you think of the coordination problems inside the Polish division sector in Iraq? They wanted to keep inside their bases and not do too much outside them, while US forces had to cross the divisional boundary to do nasty things to any Iraqi insurgent group that popped up. This is a standard issue, whether it's US-led force or UN or coalition or anything.
Or NATO. In Bosnia, same sort of thing. I was the Task Force Counterintelligence Coordinating Authority, and no one was supposed to be doing human intelligence or counterintelligence without my coordination. But I habitually rocked up on the Norwegians doing their own thing outside their sector. And of course, the Russians were doing things all over the division and not sharing it.
And the Joint Commission observers and other helpful British people.
Never saw them. But
they might have actually coordinated with you, US-British relations being as they are.
Just from this isn't even shooting, and this we're talking about from an intelligence standpoint to share information. And then we had in Tuzla, the Allied Military Intelligence Battalion was based there. The commander was a French officer when I arrived. He's a good egg, actually. And my predecessor, plus the intelligence staff in Tuzla, didn't really care for him, mostly because he was French, and they didn't understand the French and didn't get along with him. So he was literally 300 meters from where I worked at, and my predecessor visited him once. And one of the first things I did is I walked there. I'm like, wait a second, we have a NATO intelligence unit here, and we're not coordinating with them. So I introduced myself. I was a captain, and we became fast friends, and we shared information. Now, I'm sure the NATO intel guys maybe kept a little bit to themselves, but we shared all we could, which was a lot of it. Most of what we did was shareable even with the Russians. So if it's shared with the Russians, it's not really classified information. It just has a caveat on it.
If it's going to the Lubyanka, yes. And the other thing is, given their cyber intel intrusions, they know half of the things that we shouldn't be talking about anyway.
Well, they weren't that advanced 25 years ago, but
no, this is true. Nowadays, it's advanced persistent threat. What number are we up to now? 35, 38, 50, over 60? It's bloody scary, to be honest.
Yeah. So, folks, you're listening to Chris White.
In terms of getting into each other's boundaries, that is a problem that seems to occur in every UN or US-led major intervention operation, and Chris tells it right in I4 and S4 in Bosnia-Herzegovina during the late 1990s. Wouldn't be so much of a problem with the very reduced EU4 in Bosnia-Herzegovina now, just simply because it's so small. It's only the size of a battalion. But basically, people have national interests. The United States and the United Kingdom often, like the British being called shoot bats in Bosnia in the early 1990s, are often very much better prepared because they have their national interests to go after, in a kinetic, in a firefight kind of way, things that happen in technically other people's battalion or brigade or division boundaries. So that goes on, while meanwhile the Poles, or right next door to the New Zealanders in Afghanistan, the Hungarians, are just happy to sit in their camps because they're getting orders from their capitals.
Right.
Your priority is to put your political flag our political flag at the mission headquarters and get kudos when the US Secretary of State next visits Hungary. It's not to get your people killed.
No, absolutely. No, that's a disaster. That politically, domestically, that's not going to fly for them. So they're not going to take any risk whatsoever, and that's something we see all the time. It's fascinating. You mentioned the shoot bat, as they were called, but in Sierra Leone, having been there and talked to some Sierra Leoneans, and I was talking about the British intervention, they called them the shoot back.
Well, true. Yeah,
well,
exactly.
they were so accustomed to ECOWAS coming in and not shooting when people shot at them. So when the Brits came in and started shooting back, they're like, wow, it's the shoot back battalion.
Yeah. No, I mean, I unfortunately, I'm not unbiased in that regard. I'm raised in the British tradition, and my army is a descendant of the British tradition, as is the Australians and the Canadians, etc. So I tend to think the British do tend to get it right, but in that regard, they were interested in implementing the mission mandate.
Yeah.
A lot of these countries send units like the Djiboutians. Well, we're going back to Somalia. A lot of these countries send forces to an operation for other reasons, like the political kudos reasons that Chris was referring to. So they're not so interested. They'd rather get the money for their army, but that doesn't lead to better outcomes for the women, children, and men in the country in question. However, not so much. It does lead to a lot of sexual exploitation and abuse, and a lot of other kinds of nasty things, but not necessarily better outcomes.
Well, that's one of the criticisms, frustrations with a lot of UN missions historically, is that oftentimes they're simply looking for troop contingents, and there's no serious eye given to, well, listen, you guys don't really do anything when you come. We're not going to have that. You need to fulfill the mandate. So, for instance, like with UNPOL, the United Nations Police Mission in Liberia, with UNMIL, I noticed that a lot of the police contingents that came there didn't even do policing or training or anything, just sat around in restaurants and did nothing. Whereas the Jordanians, they had a force protection unit, the FPU, and the FPU did its job. It patrolled, it was out there, it was prepared. Had it come to a firefight, I'm sure they would have fired back. They also worked with the civil leadership and with the Liberian National Police, and they were quite amazing. The Jordanians really impressed me, at least their police. I didn't see combat troops there, but police, they were amazing. And the uneven performance of national contingents, either because they're taking orders from home or because they're just there to get good press because, look, we contributed, can be frustrating in a multilateral mission.
The angle that Chris hasn't picked up on there is the same thing occurred very much in the early days in Iraq. Whether it's the Poles or the Hungarians or the Czechs or the Plus Ultra Brigade from the various parts of the Spanish-speaking world, there were a lot of when the US had to form a little UN mission of their own, as it were, Combined Joint Task Force 7 or multinational force Iraq, they encountered the same problems because the Bush administration wanted flags. They didn't necessarily get troops committed to the mission.
No.
And so this was perhaps the first example of a Republican administration learning how difficult it was to get things done with a multinational force.
Well, I don't know if it's the first.
The same kinds of parallels.
I don't know if it's the first. I mean, the first Gulf War, which I was in, actually, we were a bit surprised. The Gulf Coordination Council countries, most people figured that they were just a speed bump and were not effective. But when the Iraqis invaded from Khafji, of course, there was a Marine unit up there, but it was, of course, the Gulf Coordination countries that made the difference. They were the ones engaged in combat and repulsed the Iraqis, which really surprised a lot of people. We were kind of expecting that was just, add another flag to the coalition, but they actually contributed. And then when we went into Kuwait and Iraq, it was the Arab nations that were part of the coalition that led the offensive into Kuwait itself. Now we did, the Western nations, out into Iraq, Eastern Iraq, but the west side of Kuwait. So that was a fascinating situation in which we had coalition warfare. But I mean, people, I had to ride alongside Syrian T-72s, which, in other circumstances would have been shooting at me, and Egyptian M60s and T. It was crazy. Very interesting coalition, though.
Absolutely. What Chris doesn't necessarily highlight is the same kinds of problems in Arab armies that have developed from the 1950s onwards meant that the Egyptians weren't on their first day's objectives by the end of the third day. Their Arab armies still, whether they're on the US side or not, still haven't figured out a way to effectively fight in modern combined arms warfare.
Well, to be fair, the goals were overly ambitious. They should have been more reserved in their objectives.
You criticizing Storm Norman would have, if you'd been saying that, you would have set off quite a decibel level. I tend to think from all I read about Storm and Norman.
Well, I don't think my voice would have been heard. I was a second lieutenant.
No, not as a captain or
a second lieutenant. It's a second lieutenant. Let me get to the chat here. We've got some questions before we run out of time on this stream. But let's see. There was a couple things I was going to get to, and we'll get to this in a minute. Just hold this back in our quiver. Puntland and Somaliland. Let's get to that shortly, but not yet. But there's a couple questions over here about, let's see. So Ginaldo Rose says, what does Somalia have to produce to grow economic stability in the country? Cot and charcoal from deforestation. What do they have beyond that? Fish?
And the fish are a major problem because they're a nominated reason why there's piracy. And no, there's not a lot of indigenous economic resources. And what has been there has been repeatedly fought over and destroyed and used up over 30 years of intermittent conflict. The forests are all being cut down for burning for charcoal.
Yep.
So no, the historic and Somalia has always relied on foreign help to keep its economic wheels turning. It's always needed foreign assistance, whether under the Italians, whether under the British, whether under the First Republic up to 1969, or after the military coup. It needed more economic aid than was going in than it produced going out.
Yeah. Even under the Italians, back when the Italians were there. Yep.
Indeed.
Yeah. So the next thing I want to get here is a question. Dark T says, have you ever been to Bosaso or Garowe?
Not me personally, no. Chris?
Okay. No, I've not been to either of those. No. It's a good question.
No,
actually.
all my visiting has been in southern Somalia.
Yeah, I've not been anywhere near the northern part of Somalia. Well, I mean, laterally in Ethiopia, but not in northern part of Somalia.
The people you want to talk to about Bosaso live at Dam Neck in Virginia and Coronado in California. There's seals.
There you go. And then Lori Lehtinen from Finland was the one who was going to ask, can you fill us in on the situation of Puntland? So for those who don't know, I'll just do a quick rundown, and then Colin can fill this in and flesh it out. So you have two parts of Somalia, which is Somalia today, that are located in the northern part of the country, and that is Somaliland and Puntland, both of which consider themselves to be independent republics. Somaliland declared its independence back when all this nonsense was going back on in the 90s. And they managed to put together a government that controls things, police forces, they do taxation, things like that. And they've been recognized by virtually no political entities around the world. Puntland came into existence, that's to the east of there. And while they've had some problems and been less effective than Somaliland, they're also not recognized. Colin, fill in flesh out the bones there.
First thing, as Chris said, in 1991, as all this mess was going on down in southern Somalia, the northwest bit called Somaliland declared itself independent and then went into the first of its two mini civil wars. So there were two civil wars in Somaliland that happened in the first few years after 1991. And in 1998, if you think of Somalia as a 7, and as you look at it on a 7 as written down on a page, the turn the corner, the armpit of the 7, the middle bit is Puntland, and there they formed up what they actually, Chris was incorrect there, is what they declare themselves as is a federal member state under the jurisdiction of the federal government in Mogadishu. And they are much better off. They have much less problems in terms of both Islamic State, which is present in small numbers, and Al-Shabaab. They were also getting assistance from US forces, primarily because the United States was using support to various intelligence agencies to assist the war in Yemen. But they have managed to run a relatively effective government with much less interference from nasty Islamic Takfiri terrorists for a good pretty much 20 years. And they remain better off today, partially because the nastiness, they are a much less clan variant than southern Somalia. The number of major important clans in the area in the Puntland area is much less. So there's much less room for nastiness. No particular economic assets apart from possibly the port of Bosaso. But really, Berbera in Somaliland is the big massive prize, massive former US and Soviet base.
Yep, that's true. So Roy Hayes mentioned that he trained with the Egyptian Airborne Forces, ODF. I assume he means Operation Desert Fox, or we're talking about Special Forces there. But he's trained with the Egyptian Airborne. That's interesting. He's a veteran. Now, Dark T asks if you know anything about the Puntland Maritime Police Force. I don't know anything about that. Do you?
Yes. They do a good PR job.
Okay.
The Puntland Maritime Police Force was built up in various parts of the contractor publicity world as an amazing contractor provided maritime police force who would clean up Somali piracy. It actually appears to be an internal security unit that the presidents of Puntland use to shut down their opponents. So the best way to get any money out of Western countries is to call it something to do with anti-piracy, given all these piracy
or counterterrorism.
or counterterrorism, exactly. And what they do is shut down the president's opponents. And they do that so effectively that the people I was talking to earlier today, the EU Capability Assistance Mission in Somalia, UCAPSOM, don't talk to them, are not able to work with them. They're simply unable to work with them in any way, shape, or form. Persona non grata to the internationals. Be very careful what you read or hear or understand about the PMPF. I've seen no real description of what they actually are. I just go from the things I've learned in 2 or 3 years of working on Somalia, but it's never been published properly.
Well, with deference to Mel Brooks, it's good to be the king. You can pick whatever forces you want. So now Joe Neiman said another thing here to get money from the donors, because we mentioned it. You mentioned anti-piracy. I said counterterrorism. He said anti-poaching. I'd say not so much. For instance, I had real challenges working with the Botswana Defense Force, not because of the BDF, but because one of their primary missions is anti-poaching. And we are not allowed to do that. That's a law enforcement mission. We can train infantry forces. We can train reconnaissance missions. We can train aviation and tracking, all those things. And we provide those resources, which the BDF took those skills and training that they got in assistance from us and adapted it. But when they wanted specific things to do anti-poaching that were only for that mission, like equipment, we couldn't provide that. Not by law. That's not allowed. So it depends on the donor, but most donors...
Where's the legal attaché and the federal FBI and the Department of Justice for that kind of stuff?
Do you honestly think they give a flying flip about Botswana? It's 2.1 million people and it's $20 billion GDP. Trust me, they don't.
Okay, well, that's sort of a non-comprehensive approach, or a non-joined up government, or the disinterest of the American hegemon, as it were.
Well, to be fair,
some countries are just too small.
To be fair, I was being sarcastic. The International Law Enforcement Academy is located in Ötzi in Botswana. That's one of 3 overseas, and we use that to train senior law enforcement officials from across the continent of Africa. in strategic ways to deal with organized crime, trafficking, things like that. So there is much more. And of course, there's economic assistance from the U.S. We were donating between $50 and $100 million a year to fight HIV. So there is a whole of government approach. I was being facetious because we couldn't convince there were other priorities. And Botswana's anti-poaching mission, from the view of those other actors in the U.S. government, in my estimation, they thought that the BDF had it under control and that they didn't need the assistance, and that's they could put their effort elsewhere.
And given the way that things roll out across Africa, probably in by comparison, the BDF did have it under control because the BDF is one of the most effective forces on the continent.
No doubt about it. No doubt about it. Well, speaking of obscure topics, folks, you're listening to Chris White Africa, not Chris White Africa being obscure, but Chris White Africa on the Adobe Africa channel.
Well, he's white. He's sort of pink, as am I. I'm sort of more reddish. At least according to your screen.
So what I want to say is that speaking of obscure topics, this came out recently. I know you've had a chance to glance at one of the chapters, but I have not had a chance to read the whole thing yet. But I had major issues with the introduction, which my editors put in there. But we're talking about this book here, Expanding U.S. Military Command in Africa, Elites, Networks, and Grand Strategy. This book is about the U.S. Africa Command. And I hope to get a chance to read through the whole thing and give some commentary on it. But I've been reading some excerpts from my chapter on the channel. I don't know if you've had a chance to read through it yet. Have you got a chance to read through it, or?
Oh, you're talking to me.
Yeah.
I went through Chris's chapter at high speed, and I was looking for a blow-by-blow description of how the command was stood up and what it was doing and all that kind of stuff. What I got was a somewhat defensive reaction to the torrent of bad publicity and the misunderstanding. But what the most interesting thing about it was that it was actually Rumsfeld who was the proximate factor for creating the damn thing, because he didn't want to get bothered with things like Liberia or Charles Taylor being chased out of whichever part of Liberia he was at the time. So, and the other thing about President George W. Bush, that horrible neocon, actually caring so much about Africa that every time he turned around, he started another program, which was also quite nice to hear. Africa is often seen or drops down to the bottom of world priority lists. So it's nice to have not one, but actually two presidents, a total of 4 presidential terms, where Africa, for one reason or another, has been right at the heart of US presidential priorities, for whatever reasons.
Well, on that, we'll disagree, because I was in Africa under Obama, and I can tell you the consternation of even left-leaning ambassadors, political appointees, and career diplomats frustrated the Obama administration, what it did and didn't do in Africa. Lots of big name things like food for the future, feed the future, and power Africa. Lots of credit taken for things, but nothing in the way of resources devoted. The entire assistance to Africa was virtually unchanged from the time George Bush left. Even if you include inflation, the dollar amount wasn't committed much more, and the programs were created hived away from existing programs and took money away from it. So, for instance, this whole security governance initiative, it was announced at the Africa summit that Obama held, and no funding was put there. No ambassadors on the continent were consulted. They just, his White House team said, hey, we got to do something for Africa. We got a big summit. Security governance initiative. They picked 6 countries, 4 of which were not even remotely ideal partners to do this. Ghana was included in there. Ghana was already taxed out. There's nothing more they could do. Ethiopia was put in. Ethiopia was a pain in our ass and wouldn't work with us, constantly stopping operations at which were a benefit to Ethiopia and us. And it was very frustrating. So you and I probably have very different views on what Obama did.
Oh, no, I'm just making the point that he was from an African backdrop. I am absolutely, I defer to you in half a second on the amounts of money turned on. But in terms of a different point of view, Obama represents a total change of represents a total change of approach to the 53 US presidents that came along before him, because he simply came from very different stock.
Yeah, no, that's a fair point. And frankly, since 2000, what the U.S. has been doing in Africa has been, in many respects, very different. Some of it quite the same, but many of it's very different. For instance, we don't give direct aid to governments anymore because it just goes into black holes. We work with third parties, which has its advantages and disadvantages. Dealing with NGOs and things like that can be problematic, but our aid usually goes that way. Unfortunately for the Trump administration, they announced a policy, and if they'd actually followed the policy, I think Africa would have benefited, but never really got around to it. They were focused on trade and investment in Africa, and we never really got there. That policy was announced by somebody who got fired, and it never really went very far.
Indeed.
Yeah, John Bolton announced that thing at the Heritage Foundation in December of 2018, was it? Less than 2 years into the Trump administration. And
there was a lot of things the Trump administration put up and then forgot in the next 5 minutes because they didn't have much of a policy process.
Well, that's true. Probably not much of a policy process. But the other part, let's be fair to, and I'm not a fan of Trump, although I enthusiastically voted for him, given my options. But let's be fair. The distractions were constantly thrown up, probably prevented a lot of things that could have been focused on from being the attention given to it. So tough circumstances. Well, now we've got Biden in, and we'll see what happens in Africa. But as I've told people, when Bush left office and Obama came in, I told them that. And when Obama left office and then Trump came in, and people were screaming one way or the other, I said, calm down. It's a $4 trillion Leviathan. This thing moves, and you can't stop U.S. government spending in any program overnight. Regardless of what a president wants to do or what a Congress wants to do, we will continue to fund things for a long time. Remember, the President's Emergency Program for AIDS Relief, a 5-year program, $15 billion, which actually spent $45 billion in those 5 years because it was over-appropriated, and it's still in existence 20 years later. The emergency program, well, not 20, 18 years later, it's still in existence and is not going away. So the thing is that
and
these
it
programs
hasn't been significantly defunded since the start of the Trump administration in Africa?
What, no? PEPFAR? No, I wasn't. No, I didn't. I didn't talk about funding levels. I'm saying it's still there. Well, the funding levels that were there when Trump came in can't be changed. That's legislation was passed that covered that time frame. So,
I see.
So if we looked at the future,
I thought anytime you appropriate another NDAA, you can change any funding level you like.
But PEPFAR is not
under the DOD annual budget.
No. PEPFAR has nothing to do with.
Oh, DOD. I see. It's not DOD exactly.
Exactly.
It's
and it's not.
Chris will always run rings around me on the innards of the U.S. government, obviously.
Well, but it's nothing to do with the defense. That's actually when just to go into PEPFAR briefly, when PEPFAR was created, I went to the Kaiser Foundation in D.C. and I was working at the Pentagon at that time, and there was a lot of consternation, particularly in the gay community, complaining and also about development agencies, because when it was done initially, PEPFAR, the first authorization required 1/3 of the money to be spent on abstinence, 1/3 on treatment, and 1/3 on what was the other thing? Anyway, but 3 different areas. So, and they were upset. They said that you can't waste this money in abstinence. No one, it doesn't work. It doesn't work. And then a few people at the conference were there who had experience in Uganda said, well, in fact, it can work. Look at the results in Uganda in the late 80s and the early 1990s where they got in control, and abstinence played a key role. But by and large, most people were against that. And they're all quibbling. And I got up and I said, excuse me. Since the days of Reagan, the U.S. government has spent $642 million fighting HIV, doing vaccine research, public awareness, advertisements, campaigns, $642 million. We're talking 15 years. You people are going to sit here and whine about $15 billion that are going to be spent on this because 1/3. So you still got $10 billion. Let's see. I'm not good at math, but you're over 10 times better off. You're over 10 times better off than you were yesterday. Could we please move on? Anyway, I actually got a round of applause.
No, it does make sense. And if it worked in Uganda, then let's try it. Overpopulation is one of the things that will probably, as far as I'm concerned, kill us all someday.
Well, but eventually that program was shifted, but they explicitly laid out initially. But the bottom line is that the program is where it's been used well by partners, and most of it's spent in Africa, by the way. Some is spent in Thailand, elsewhere, Vietnam, but most of PEPFAR is spent actually in Africa, about 85% of it. Where it's been used well, it's had a tremendous impact. Botswana is one great example. 38% of the adult population was HIV positive in 2000. And despite the fact that it's the only country in the world with universal access to antiretrovirals for free, which means that people with HIV live, so you can't take them off the rolls of HIV positive. It used to be that the numbers kept growing while thousands died all the time, and you still had high growth. That meant a lot more people getting infected. So what's happening now is that the numbers of new increase, of course, because those with HIV live and more live, and so that's built into the figure until people die of old age or other causes. So, but Botswana's down below 16%.
We've lost you, Chris.
Am I gone? Hello?
No, you're back on.
Oh, okay. That's YouTube messing with my channel probably, or your data connection.
You just froze for a moment.
Oh,
Your
okay.
your God look was a bit stilted.
Anyway, yeah, but this wasn't about PEPFAR. We could talk about that on another conversation. But Chris Falcon says my mane is looking majestic. Okay, well, thank you for that. Not accustomed to this long hair. So you're back in Nairobi, and I take it you're there for the foreseeable future, doing your work.
Doing various things. I'm not working for anybody. Well, I'm on the U.S. government payroll, as it were. Actually, Air University, U.S. Air Force.
Oh.
But that is funding my ability to go asking interesting questions of people like the various advocacy groups or the operators there, trying to get questions sorted out about AMISOM, the future of the African Standby Force, some various Somali forces, and Ethiopia and so forth. We haven't even managed to touch on the nasty and horrific situation which is unrolling in Tigray at the moment.
Oh yeah, no, we haven't even touched on it. That's a whole interesting separate topic. Yeah, that's
interesting. It's heart-rending.
It's actually pathetic what's happening there. It should be happening. I mean, Abe came in, and actually I gave him a lot of props. I mean, it looked like a new day was dawning. But now with Tigray, you have to sit and scratch your head. I mean, how serious are these people that run Ethiopia when this is happening? It's really a mess. And they just basically declared any member that was in the military that was stationed in Tigray when this thing started as treasonous, even if they hadn't done anything or they even expressed their interest in Tigray. They just declared them. So that's, as a serving military member, I would hate to be stationed in Texas, and because there's a dispute with Texas and the United States, and I'm in the U.S. Army where I swore an oath to the Constitution, they decide that I'm an alien or that I'm a criminal because they station me in Texas. That's ludicrous. Anyway.
No, Chris, you fully understand. It's because the windmills are freezing. That's why you're the Constitution.
It's definitely why people are
frozen
cold.
Up and dropped off, perhaps.
Definitely people cold in Texas as a result of that. There's I want to ask you a question before we wrap up, and then there's a question for Citizen Guardian, which is addressed to me, but I'll give you a chance to add on it too. Actually, let me go with that, and then I'll come back to my question. My question is about the U.S. being pulling troops out of there. So, but Citizen Guardian, who is based in South Africa, he's a survivalist, a prepper, pretty good guy too, smart guy. He says, on average, do you see Africa as a continent improving in the future regarding its economical situation? Well, Citizen Guardian, I'm always optimistic about the potential for Africa and African countries, many in particular, but I'm pessimistic about political leadership in Africa. There's a lot of fanfare about the African Continental Free Trade Agreement, and I wrote extensively about that on LinkedIn, posted, commented on it frequently. I haven't done it so much on this channel, but the African Continental Free Trade Agreement is a nice idea, but the instantiation and enforcement of it is going to be something completely different. A lot of people are acting as if it solves the problems, but as of yet, they're supposed to deliver this in January of this year, which they failed to do ostensibly because of Corona. They were supposed to deliver the protocols for copyright protections and intellectual property protections, infringements, things like that, and that wasn't delivered. So until you have protections for your writings, your music, for your art, for your inventions, other people will simply copy them. Also, there's nothing really built into the African Continental Free Trade Agreement that addresses protectionism. So if Uganda doesn't want bananas coming from Rwanda, they can simply put up barriers, and there's no mechanism to seek redress. That's a problem. So I'm always optimistic about the potential of Africa. It has great resources, human capital, natural resources, agricultural resources, phenomenal place. But political leadership is always a challenge. I don't know. You want to add anything to that, Colin? Any thoughts on that? You're really a security guy.
I'm just going to say the standard thing about free trade agreements, which is that they're not automatic and instant about free trade. There are a whole series of checkboxes. Do we want free trade on this particular sector? Do we want free trade on green bananas versus slightly yellow bananas? No, we won't have any free trade on oranges versus Kruger apples. But West Cape apples will declare open for free trade purposes, but you can't have Durban apples. No, we'll keep we've got a political constituency in Durban, so no, Durban apples are not going to be free. It's all this question of bit by bit by bit. Every commodity and service has to be has to be negotiated, which is why these agreements can be tens of thousands of pages long. And in terms of AFCERTA, it's not. I don't see any of that actually laid down and functioning yet. Yeah. They really are just getting to the point where they have to start negotiating it.
Right, but the problem is the African intellectuals and political leaders run around as if, look, we're all going to become instantly wealthy and poverty is going to be obliterated because we have this agreement. No, give me a break. That's juvenile.
No. You get instantly wealthy and prominent in Africa by becoming a politician, which comes back exactly to what Chris was saying. We both are probably fair to be saying it, that we're both deeply worried and scandalized by the performance of African leaders in the past. Well, really, since the 1960s, though there have been some good exceptions and examples.
Well, speaking of exception, Erica said she's never seen an African leader who didn't have their fingers in the cookie jar. I can give you one. Festus Mogai from Botswana. Never had his fingers in the cookie jar.
Or the Khamas from Botswana.
Yeah. Well,
there are one or two. Perhaps Mohammed Igal from Somalia, the first Prime Minister of Somalia. And yeah, after that it gets a bit hard.
It does. It's a short list.
Yes, it is a short list. But no, there have been good African leaders. Do not go away and say all of them are horrific, because there have been some good ones, or there have been some good ones that died quick, ugly deaths and in the wrong circumstances.
Well, and other countries like Mauritius and also Cape Verde have had a series of good leadership and governance over the years. We've had, even Malawi's had a few good presidents. It's a short list, but they've had a few. There's a question from Lori.
Just don't mention the name of Banda.
Lori has a question here, and before I get to my question, I think it's worth asking. She thanked us for the input on Puntland and said, could you two please comment on the death of Siad Barre and the Soviet Union? Any thoughts on Siad Barre?
Sorry, the death of Siad Barre and the Soviet Union?
Yeah.
No, not that. The two events aren't particularly related.
Yeah.
The whole thing was falling apart. It wasn't the fact that it was early 1991. It was the Cold War thing that was coming to pieces. Or really, by the time it was moving into 1987, 1988, and the Civil War was starting, it wasn't really the fact that the Cold War was ending at the time. It was the fact that Siad Barre had managed to poison the country with clan hatreds by pumping up clan hatreds.
Yeah.
It's not that the clan hatreds existed. He used them. He politically instrumentalized them, if you want to use academic language. He used them to support his own power and diminish others' power.
Yeah, it reminds
so it wasn't really connected with the fall of the Soviet Union.
Now, his behavior reminds me very much of Slobodan Milosevic. Did exactly the same thing in former Yugoslavia.
Yes, no, that is a good comparison.
Yeah. So Deborah Olivier said, gosh, what a spunky New Zealander. Well, here, listen, Deborah, they're all like that. They come from this incredibly beautiful country that's far wealthier than it should be. It's not fair. They should only be picking coconuts and fishing with nets there. But unfortunately, they're very wealthy and they're very cheeky as a consequence. So when you deal with a Kiwi, also they're confusing because they have this bizarre accent. It's not Australian. It's not UK. It's not American. But since they have UK heritage, because they have this competition with Australia, and because they watch American TV, they have a really funky accent. We can't quite figure it out. But that is the Kiwis. So,
no, I should also note that you should never, ever, ever take anything coming from anybody living in Pennsylvania as anything to be relied on whatsoever. You could only listen to Chris if he moves back to some good law-abiding state like a southern Mississippi or something.
Well, I would love to live in Wellington, but I'm unwelcome as an American unless I have $20 billion to deposit in the bank there. So,
no, only 20 million, but yes.
Oh yeah, only 20 million, not 20 billion. But okay, the question I wanted to ask you, Colin, and this I'm pretty sure I know the answer, and I don't think we'll disagree on this. But let me just ask you this. So, Trump has ostensibly pulled out the U.S. Troop presence, 500 in Somalia. Good thing or bad thing for Somalia's security going forward?
Let's clarify that slightly. They have been repositioned elsewhere, which means the barracks.
I did use the word ostensibly.
Yes, the barracks at Le Monnier in Djibouti are no doubt quite a lot fuller. The USS Mackinac Island amphibious ready group is probably a bit fuller, and I would be expecting the Manda Bay Camp Simba, to be a lot fuller right now. No, it's a bad thing. From my lefty perspective, pulling US troops out is automatically a good thing, right? No, well, I'm a lefty, and I'm saying right now, keeping Al-Shabaab on the hop from the air, from drone strikes, from precision emplacement and raids of special forces is a damn good thing, because Al-Shabaab otherwise has got everybody on the back foot. It's severely bad for the rest of the AMISOM forces. So it would be better had they not gone. Lizzie Shackleforth is correct when she wrote in one of her recent commentaries for, I think it was Brookings, yes, eventually they should go. Yes, eventually everybody should go, and the Somalis should run their own affairs. But pulling them out the way it was done is, in my view, will mean that more women, children, and men in Somalia suffer worse outcomes.
Yeah, it's a good answer. And it is interesting how politics really twists people around and the presumptions about people's view. Because as you said, look, I'm a lefty, and people would think I'd be happy the troops come out. I'm center and slightly to the right center politically, and I oppose U.S. troop deployment in Somalia because I knew it was not a mess we wanted to get involved in. If we want to use proxies, as long as they're effective, that was the approach to go with. Although, as we point out earlier, 14 years, or as I point out, 14 years with no political will, that's part of the problem. Yeah. So now Lori in Finland says, it's interesting. She's talking about, only knew about the AU contingent. Maybe I misswitched. But if we're talking about Somalia, it's the Turks have built a military base for Somalia. The Turks are involved there. The Emirates are involved in Somalia. There's a lot of people playing in the sandbox.
Yes. Well, there's no reason to think. This is the 21st century now. There is no written law saying only the EU, UN, US, and UK, and maybe some other European countries can go and do things in the developing world. Right now, Turkey, the United Arab Emirates, the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia, Qatar, and various other places like India and Pakistan are all big regional players, and they get involved. The UAE raised a battalion in Somalia, which was potentially off to fight in Yemen, but never quite got there. The Turks are raising 5 battalions of trained Somali troops, with another 5 on the way. And yes, the Qatar is spreading money around quite liberally in Somali terms, but potentially quite a small amount in Arab oil money terms. And yes, they're all regional players, and they get involved. In a slightly less low-key way than Ethiopia, sort of sending tens of thousands of troops across the border and smashing the whole place up. But yeah, they're regional powers. There's no law saying it's only the US and UK.
No, absolutely, but I mean, I think there's a lot of people simply aren't aware of what's going on. For instance, I talk a lot about Turkey and Africa, and a lot of times when I introduce people to Turkey and Africa, it's a surprise, complete surprise. They have no idea. I always ask the question, so who has the largest number of diplomatic missions in Africa? And usually the answer is the UK or France, because people presume because of their colonial history they'd have more diplomatic missions. No, it's the US, of course. We have the most diplomatic missions across Africa, but we're followed closely because of the last 15 years of development by Turkey. Turkey has the second most. It's not China. People think it's China, but it's actually Turkey has more diplomatic missions in Africa than China even. And
the United States has a mission in every African country, or are there some that are missing?
We don't have a mission in Western Sahara, of course, because we don't recognize it. We don't have, yeah. But
sure, but that's 1 out of 54 or so. Right. Are there any others missing?
Every other country we have a diplomatic mission in Africa.
Oh, okay.
Yep.
All right. Yeah.
And
Well, that's good.
and diplomatic
Now,
missions.
now you just have to staff them properly.
But no, they are staffed properly. That's not a problem. But the other thing too is that's not all diplomatic missions. Diplomatic missions also include our consulates. In South Africa, we have a consulate in Cape Town, a consulate in Johannesburg, a consulate in Durban. So there's 3 more diplomatic missions. We also have special representatives for the Great Lakes. That's a diplomatic mission, and there's a couple of other that take place. So in aggregate, not just embassies, but when I say diplomatic missions, but Turkey has trade officers across Africa, several of them now. So and also Turkey's heavily involved in Ethiopia in investment. They've poured a couple $1 billion of foreign direct investment in Ethiopia, and they're also heavily involved in Somalia. And of course, Turkish Airways is flying all over Africa now. They're growing almost as fast as Ethiopian, which is pretty interesting. But anyway, that's just to let people know that Africa.
Ethiopia is going a bit backwards right now. They're suffering some internal problems.
Oh, they absolutely are. But I'm talking about over the past several years, Turkish.
Before Tigray kicked off.
Yeah, exactly. Before Tigray, but that's a recent development. So, but that's a risk you take in Africa. Instability. So that's a challenge you have to face. But anyway, so Colin, we'll go and wrap up here. Anything you want to share with us, and then about either Somalia or any thoughts about what's going on anywhere else other than domestic terrorism and armed insurrections at the Capitol building on the 6th of January.
Right. Last parting shot. Remember Russia.
Oh, yeah.
Their contractors are actually their military intelligence service, and they're popping up in diverse places as much as Madagascar and the Central African Republic and Libya and so forth. But no, sorry, that's a pop-off from a very old and probably overblown topic. The question, the point that really it comes down to from the current events in Somalia or anywhere else is that it's about expressing the people's will, and it's about ineffective and uninterested leadership that is not interested in doing the right thing for the country. So probably Chris and I would both agree that it's about trying to make the will of the people work for whatever the particular circumstances are. And that's why we would, again, probably both agree that democracy and democratization is the best way for most countries in the world, however culturally expressed.
No, I think it's well said, Colin. And you're right. I would agree with you pretty much wholeheartedly on what you said there. Great thoughts. Listen, it's a pleasure to have you back. You're now, I think, other than Giselle, my most frequently appearing guest with a 3rd appearance on the program. So
sure,
might have to make you an associate of the Indaba Africa group just to go forward. Of course, we can't pay you anything, so you know.
Well, I'll just start sending the invoices anyway.
Oh, okay. Well, that's kind of how it works with Amazon. They send the invoices. They just never get paid. Anyway, so live from Nairobi, it's been Dr. Colin Robinson, a longtime colleague. As I mentioned to my audience in the build-up to you appearing on the program, you and I have known each other for a long time, and I first became aware of who you were because of a foreign policy article, I Built an African Army by Sean McFate, that was published online. I had a subscription to Foreign Policy, but I was in an embassy in Africa, and my mail was 3 weeks delayed to get to me by diplomatic pouch. So I hadn't read it yet, and I had a Google search term for Liberia and Wyatt because I just left Liberia, and I wanted to make sure there was no bad news. And I got this thing, and I clicked on a link. It took me right to your comment on the Foreign Policy article. It says, I'll paraphrase. You're like, listen, I'm researching security sector reform, and I don't know who this guy McFate is, but all the research I found says the guy responsible for rebuilding Armed Force Liberia is Lieutenant Colonel Chris Wyatt. And I was like, whoa, where'd that come from? And that's kind of how we first became introduced to each other. And we've seen each other all over the world, Colin. You've come to Stuttgart, and I've taken you to Africa Command. We've linked up in Liberia. You've come to the War College here in the States. I think probably the only place that we need to link up, it haven't happened yet, is in New Zealand. But, Jacinda doesn't like me, so I can't go there.
No, Jacinda would like you, Chris, but only if you shave the beard off.
Well, I mean, the beard now is staying because of lockdown. It's a lockdown beard, and I'm going to get one trip to Europe, one trip to Africa because I want to go through immigration and see what kind of looks I get. They're probably like,
oh, yes. Just make sure you dress up in flowing Arab robes, and your ID card is filled with Al Bin and all these other hyphenated Sultan, all those kinds of things. And I guarantee you won't get through the airport.
Well, actually, if you go through Heathrow, that will get you through the airport. If you're pink skinned like this,
No.
and
I'm talking
shaven,
about you're going to a U.S. airport.
Oh, no. I'm saying, but if I go to Heathrow and I go through with pink skin and clean shaven and short hair, I get harassed all the time by the UK nationals of Pakistani and subcontinent origin who just seem to have a joy pulling me over and questioning me, asking me, what are you doing in the UK? I don't know. I thought it spent some money here. Your economy looked kind of stagnant to me. Anyway, all right, Dr. Colin Robinson, pleasure to have you back on the channel once again, and we'll get you back on sometime soon if you'd like to come back on.
Cheers. Thanks so much. Bye.
Right. I'll let you drop off, and I'll close out the program. All right, that's Colin, folks. Whoa, we got to fix that. There we go. Anyway, folks, thanks for tuning in. I hope you found this interesting. Colin, fantastic. And just for all the haters out there that always claim that that I only have like-minded people on here, clearly you can see that Colin and I are colleagues, and we don't agree on a number of things. He's on the left side of the political spectrum, and I'm in the center, but honestly a bit more to the right. Nonetheless, we can work together and reach agreement on the critical issues that matter. And I think that's a good statement for folks around the world. You can work with people on the other side of the aisle as long as they're reasonable and rational. But anyway, so thanks to my special featured guest, Colin Robinson, talking about Somalia today. I hope you found it interesting. Listen, folks, I will be back on in about 30 minutes because, 20 minutes. I have to take a quick break, get something to drink, hit the loo, and I'll be back at 2 more streams today. There's a press conference from NASA about an update on what's happening with the Sol 1 mission. That's the Perseverance Mars rover, which landed successfully yesterday. And I'll be back on in about 20 minutes to broadcast that. Please tune in back in for that. That's an unusual time for me to broadcast. And then I'll be on. We'll see how that press conference goes, and offer commentary and analysis of what they had to say and what's happening with the Perseverance rover mission. And then I'll be back for the Night Owls stream, but I've termed it, Night Owls Meeting Martians, because there's another NASA broadcast, including astrophysicist Mugega Cooper, who will be on, among others, and we'll pop her on, and we'll talk about NASA, and we'll talk about the Perseverance mission. So there you go. Anyway, folks, thanks a lot. I appreciate your tuning in. Marauder says informative discussion was great. And a lot of other people said nice things. Thank you so much for that. And once again, my thanks to Colin Robinson. Please tune in shortly. I'll see you guys back here in just a little bit, and let's see if YouTube finds a reason to block this video. Anyway, folks, thanks a lot. We'll catch you here shortly, and have a lovely evening. Oh, Topsy Klutz just gave a $5 super chat. I'm going to hang around and wait for that to pop up. Thank you for the super chat there, Topsy Klutz. Wow, cool beans. There it is. Happy Friday. Yep, lekker Freitag. We'll be back for that in just a little bit. Thanks a lot, folks, and I am out of here. Boom. There we go.